the more I learn about the operations of the subatomic world, the more I learn about the anomalies of quantum mechanics, superposition and quantum entanglement, and what Einstein called spooky action at a distance, and so on, things that defy our logic and reason, the more it strikes me that the universe is waiting to find out what we want to do. That things are created in such a way that it favors the journey to self-awareness.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Free Radical Podcast. Today we are meeting a unique Vaishnava thinker, author, and teacher, Yogeshwar Das. Yogeshwar is an educator and biographer. His biographies of witnesses to the Holocaust have sold more than 500,000 copies. His documentaries on the Nazi period have aired on PBS and Discovery. He has written editorials on war crimes from the Los Angeles Times, Chicago Tribune, and other publications. His spiritual works include Here Comes the Sun, exploring George Harrison's spiritual journey, and Swami in a Strange Land, a biography of A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. His biography of Sri Chaitanya will be published next year. So we had a beautiful conversation with Yogeshwar Prabhu, talking mostly about the dialogue that faith and reason are having or can potentially have, science and spirituality, their complementarities, their differences, their deep points in common. On that foundation, we explored what's matter, what's consciousness, how to define both, how to properly redefine both, and many other related topics. So we invite you to the table. This is the Free Radical Podcast, and to support it, please subscribe to our channel by clicking in the bell. And if you feel inspired, nourished, supported by the conversation, like it, share it, drop your thoughts in the comment section so we can keep this dialogue for what it is, an ongoing conversation with reality. So without further ado, dear friends, brothers, sisters, here is Yogeshwar. Dear Yogeshwar Prabhu, welcome to the Free Radical Podcast, and thank you so much for joining us. It's our pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And for those who are not so familiar with Yogeshwar Prabhu, at least in my connection, I first connected with him, I think, with some online interactions in the past. Then we have a mutual friend in Satyaraj Prabhu and many others, I'm sure. And more recently, I got to know you from some of your conversations with Krishna Lila. That actually she was featured in the previous podcast to this one. We have been talking about emotional healing and trauma in bhakti. And some months ago, I recall we had some nice conversations on Holocaust theology and theodicy and topics like that. So, I mean, you are a person that we could go into so many directions in our conversation. We could talk about, again, theodicy and yoga, Holocaust theology, emotional, psychological balance and integration in bhakti. But somehow today we have chosen to focus on one particular theme, which is the intersection between science and spirituality. And I'm thinking, before I pass you on the mic, Yogeshwar Prabhu, I recall a few months ago I had in my podcast invited Krishna Kshetra Maharaj, and the title of the conversation was Dialogical Vaishnavism. And basically, we were talking about the importance of dialogue and concluded how the whole makeup of reality is somehow dialogical. There's always some conversation going on. There's a relationality. There's an interconnectedness between everything. So somehow dialogue is intrinsic to the very makeup of reality. So on that basis, at least personally, I believe not only we need to engage in dialogue with reality as a whole, we need to broaden our horizons by engaging in reality, in dialogue with other mystical traditions, with members of other families in our own mystical tradition also. But also, I'm for engaging in dialogue with secular disciplines that could inform our journey, our practice, and our ideas. And for me, science is arguably the main one, if not one of the main ones, if not the main one. So yeah, at least in my opinion. Let's hear yours now. But
You're to be credited. You're to be given much credit for taking that initiative and for understanding the dialogical quality of the search for meaning and the search for our own an understanding of ourselves in the world. We're social creatures. We're curious creatures, and if you, I think if you study the great thinkers of history, they were all quite, polymaths. They were quite eclectic. They weren't two-dimensional beings. They were curious. They had a healthy curiosity about other traditions. So, bravo to you for leading the way there.
Thank you for your humbling words. And so, yeah, in connection to your point that great personalities are not two-dimensional, they are complex, they are nuanced, they are open to interaction with so many layers of existence. And I appreciate your word curiosity. So for me, in this, spirit, faith, and reason are not adversaries, but actually partners in the quest for meaning, as you put it, for purpose, for truth. So for me, science and spirituality can sit on the same table, and I will add, should sit at the same table. And I cannot avoid recalling this famous quote from process theologian Alfred Whitehead. He will say, like, the future course of history actually depends upon understanding the relationship between faith and reason. So it was strong words, at least for me. The future course of history depends how nicely we get along with each other between science and spirituality, because, at least in my opinion, and I like to hear, of course, your thoughts, but for me, when faith is like unable to engage with scientific insights, it risks like devolving into some type of superstition at some point. And similarly, for me, when a scientific approach, entirely dismisses mysticism and the experiences of sages and so on, faith, it may start to border into a delusion of grandeur, so to say, superiority complex of sorts. So for me, both perspectives lose something essential when they ignore each other. So I don't know, how do you see the relationship between faith and
science
reason?
has done a better job. I mean, of the two, science has done a much better job of presenting its case for a number of reasons. Leading among those reasons is the fact that science provides us with technology. It does stuff. You don't have to believe in God or eternity or eternal souls to do good medicine. There's a pragmatism to science. There's a rational logic to it that's very compelling. And for better or for worse, the wisdom traditions, which is how I like to describe it. I don't particularly like the word religion because I think it's misunderstood. So what we might say, what you're saying, an openness to faith, quoting Whitehead, has done a poorer job of presenting its case. For one, it doesn't have laboratory experimenting to prove it. How do you prove evolving consciousness? How do you prove wisdom? How do you prove the existence of other lives or other universes beyond our own? Faith means going beyond whatever rational evidence there is to the contrary. So there haven't been, sad to say, I think, a sufficient community of eloquent spokespeople for, I won't say a religious point of view, let's say the metaphysical. If science is the physical, let's say the additional dimension is the metaphysical. So there have not been sufficient numbers of eloquent spokespeople for the metaphysical dimensions of reality. And that's unfortunate. I think it's changing. I think that, there are developments in science today, and by today I mean very recently, only within the past 10, 15 years, that point to some really provocative symmetries, between millennial texts and very recent discoveries, in astrophysics and biochemistry and so on. So, when you study religion, which is, where I come out of that world academically, you learn about two kinds of religion. There's reflective and there's popular. Reflective religion it's for thinking people, it's for intellectuals, it's for scholars, people who are willing to go deep into the background of faith traditions. And the popular religion is a more sentimental approach. It's people who may have an enthusiasm or religious feeling, but not much else. And I think a sign of a healthy life, wherever you come down on that scale, is the ability to integrate the emotional and the intellectual, right? So the practice and the philosophy, so that the intellect is energized by contemplative practice, and the practice is disciplined and directed by the intellect.
Amen. Thank you. Beautiful. I totally agree with that. I was thinking while listening to you, and we were talking about faith and reason, and sometimes disconnected with spirituality and science, but even ourselves as spiritual practitioners have to, this dialogue between faith and reason has to happen, as you are pointing now, inside of our own self. Now, the dialogue is not just external. Let's talk with the scientist, of course, also, but let's talk with the faith part of myself, and let's attend my reason voice as well, as you say, and let's see how we can integrate both in the best possible way. Because if not, as you say, I feel when we are not doing that job ourselves to begin with at home, we won't find too many articulate voices in the community that are able to convey, as you will put, the metaphysical dimensions of reality in a way that is inviting for a deep dialogue with scientific circles or with anyone. But again, the dialogue has to begin with ourselves, right? And I agree with you that science has done so far a way better job, and also in upholding its foundational principles, right? Like science is a lot about openness, disclosure, and permanent questions and curiosity, in your words, and never reaching a closing point. Which, and I will say that in that sense, spirituality has a lot to do with that as well. But many times we have misrepresented the wisdom traditions by becoming overtly, addicted to certainty, addicted to closure, to absolute truths, where the dialogue is finished and we fell in love more with answers than with questions. So,
well, you find that
opinion,
on both sides.
yeah.
I mean, that kind of strident insistence on being right, you find both in the science community and in the contemplative community. That's not exclusive to people who have some vision of invisible worlds. And it's as obnoxious coming from rational thinking intellectuals as it is from people with their head in the clouds. You don't want to hear that kind of absolutism from anybody. What's exciting is when what you're talking about, when there's this kind of neutral ground where people can come together and discuss their respective realizations and understandings, and where these two perspectives can complement each other and can nourish each other. That's a beautiful thing. And I think we're coming to that point. Yes, certain voices in the science field, I think, become a bit too strident, a little too insistent, as you're saying, that we've got it. We've got our standard model, and once we discovered the Higgs boson, we had the final missing piece of the puzzle, and now we understand how the universe operates. And there's really no need of any references to transcendental forces, to divine beings, or anything like that. We've got it. have you got?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you look closely, what is it that they've got? What they've got is deeper and deeper mysteries.
Yeah.
What we're looking at, the deeper we go, the more sophisticated our tools of observation, the deeper we go into the workings of matter. Things don't get more clarified; they get fuzzier.
Yeah.
They get more impossible to understand, and you reach a point where the behavior on very, very small scales is mind-boggling. They do not follow the rules of logic and reason and the Newtonian universe at all.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think we do a disservice when we draw any kind of too premature conclusions about what we know and what we don't know. And I think the same is true also for people who wish to represent the Bhagavad Gita, people who wish to represent the Puranic perspectives. We're a little too quick to pull that trigger. Here we got it. It's right there. It's in the text, and that's all you need to know. When I meet those people, and I'm meeting them all the time, as I'm sure you are, I kind of roll my eyes, and I appreciate that they're trying to be sincere, but I think they do a disservice by becoming the kind of faith equivalent of scientism, where
I was just thinking about the word scientism at this precise moment. Glad that you brought it. Yeah.
You want to be able to have a reasonable conversation with people, and there's, I think, level-headed, thoughtful individuals appreciate the insights that come from both sides. And that's a real beautiful thing. The scientists who have my admiration, all recognize that science, first of all, is not very old. It started with Enlightenment thinking in the 17th century. And the vision at that point was that the universe was this big, fantastical machine, working according to very mechanical laws and formulas. And, up until Einstein at the early part of the 20th century, Newtonian physics ruled supreme for 300 plus years. That was our vision of the world. This is how things operate. And then along comes this patent clerk, who says, well, wait a minute, it's a little different. So, so knowing the history, by the way, I think is a very important thing. Knowing how we came to where we are now in science, in consciousness studies, which is really pushing the boundaries, is very important for arriving at that place of a union of thinking and dialogue.
I was thinking, Yogeshwar Prabhu, about the simple point of engaging in conversation and leaving the door open for dialogue between science and spirituality, or between everyone and anyone. But for engaging in any true constructive dialogue, there has to be a willingness to be transformed by the dialogue itself, right? By whatever happens in that conversation. If I just come to this conversation with you with my whole list of assumptions, uncertainties, and absolute conclusions, and I'm not willing to give up any of those, even though we are externally talking, I wouldn't say there is, strictly speaking, there is no dialogue actually, because each one is fixing their own conclusions. So for me, a big part of this conversation is the willingness to listen to one another, both from science toward metaphysical wisdom traditions, and vice versa. And listening to one another, of course, means letting go of preconceived notions and ideas and remaining open to the uncovering.
You're putting your finger on it. I mean, right there, that's the biggest hurdle, the biggest obstacle to achieving that kind of an open dialogue. On the one hand, you have thinking men and women working in various fields of science who, not all, but some, are absolutely distrustful of anything that cannot stand up to the scientific test of certitude and reality. What makes something universal, true, absolute, and necessary. You have to be able to test it experimentally. You have to be able to repeat that experiment. Other people in other conditions in other parts of the world have to be able to conduct the same experiments and come up with the same answers. There's a verifiability to something before it can be accepted as science. And the risk there, of course, is if you close that field of reference, that epistemological approach, that way of knowing reality too tightly, if it's too trapped within its own definition of what is acceptable, then there are things that we'll never be able to understand. If you begin from the premise that there is only matter, that's all there is in the universe, we're not going to talk about anything else, then every time we come up against an anomaly, it just gets shunted off to the side. It's put on a shelf. It doesn't inform our understanding of what's going on. We've predetermined that these are the limits of what we'll accept as real. And the same is true, I think, for people who have some faith in non-material causality. We might call it a spiritual background architecture to the universe, that science can be threatening to them. Why? Because if you don't know the language of science, if you're not part of that clubhouse, it can be very intimidating. I mean, if you don't know how to defend yourself against someone who describes for you the latest discoveries in subatomic physics and particle physics and in astrophysics and in neuroscience, and all of a sudden you're overwhelmed by this lingo, then that, if your devotional life is fragile, that can be very threatening. So it's understandable that people on both sides would have this kind of hesitation if their sense of themselves is insecure.
Good
and
point.
I think that's a topic that we need to discuss, is how can you prepare yourself for entering into that dialogue without being intimidated by it?
Yeah, great point. Yeah, but thinking, if you want to engage in comprehensive conversation with science or with spirituality from the scientific perspective, you have to have not only the capacity to understand the lingo, as you say, to be able to articulate your ideas in a way that is understandable for the other person, not expecting the other person to fully understand your own lingo, but also expecting some familiarity or getting each other acquainted with their own lingo so we can actually have a conversation. But as you say, for me, an important point you made is how sure you are in yourself when bringing these conversations, and how much you are in the need to convert everyone to your creed as part of your own insecurity or willingness to listen and be transformed and changed from a foundation of security in yourself. Because
it gets kind of comical. I mean, on both sides. I remember, for example, going to some lectures. I have a brother, Brian Green, who's a physicist.
Yeah.
And we have great conversations about this stuff. I love him dearly. He's wonderful. And he has something called the World Science Festival here in New York every year. So, it's been 15, 20 years he's been doing this. So I've gone to a lot of the programs. It's in June usually, and there are 50, 60 programs all over New York City. I mean, the top thinkers in every field, the Nobel Prize laureates and so on. And I remember many years ago going to one about the brain and creativity, and there were brain scientists up on the stage, and they're showing computer animation projections overhead on a big screen about, well, when the brain has a creative thought, this area lights up. You saw red colors and blue colors, and seems very impressive. And then there was one non-scientist guest on the panel, the modern dance choreographer Bill T. Jones, who is one of my heroes. And Jones was asked to get up and do a creative 1-minute improvisational piece. And so there was a cellist playing, and he said, I'm going to give myself 1 square foot, and I'm not going to step outside that 1 foot. So for 1 minute, I have to do gestures without repeating once. And it was beautiful, absolutely beautiful.
Can imagine.
So then afterwards, nobody said anything. You know, the other 5 panelists or whatever, no one's thanking him or saying anything about it. They went back to their computer projections and, you know, the brain's doing this and that. And then and Bill's just sitting there, just like, you know. So the host asks him, what do you think about all this? And he says, well, I have to be very honest with you that I'm concerned. He said, I'm concerned that someday we're going to reach a point where someone's going to say, okay, we're going to have a dance program. Let's come up with some new dances. And they go to their computer, especially now with AI. And we're going to come up with a new dance program. These are the parameters of it. You key it in, and boom, it comes out, and there's your new dance. He says, I'm very concerned about that. He says, when I get up and dance, the only word that comes to my mind to describe how it feels is spiritual. And what happened next shocked the heck out of me. The people on that stage, not only did they not respond to him, they ignored him.
I mean, he said this openly, publicly. He was asked about this.
He's on the panel, and there's an audience. This is a live program. They acted as if he wasn't even there. No one bothered to ask him about it. No one bothered to offer a different point of view. It's as like he was a non-entity. I felt so embarrassed. I felt so bad about it. So you've got that kind of bias on the one hand. Then I've been in yoga studios. I'm invited to give, Bhagavad Gita classes and yoga studios all over the place. So I'll sit in sometimes on the classes. At the beginning of yoga classes, there's something that's often called Dharma talk. It's a few minutes of philosophy, right? And I'm hearing these yoga teachers bandy these Sanskrit words around, like confetti, and come in and lose your kleshas and let go of your dharmas, and get rid of your karmas. And if you're losing your samsaras, look at the lost and found at the death. I mean, I don't know what they're talking about. These complicated ideas. So there's this, I think, bias on both sides, this unwillingness to open up to a deeper level. And I think it's because of fear. I think there's a fear that if I allow myself to become too open, then my particular sense of myself is going to be jeopardized.
Yeah, and if there is a fear, we may fear the most is being left with no identity at all. No, like my sense of self is disappearing. We may fear, and how fear is is the underlying principle behind so many of these things. Which for me, I tend to think in those terms. Whether we speak sometimes even about in our tradition the different anarthas or lust and greed and this and that. For me, behind all of those, there is some layer of fear that we need to contact to understand what's behind the apparent problem. There's a meta problem behind that, and so much there is fear there in the background as a result of a dualistic vision of reality. So for me, that allows us to be more compassionate with one another, understand, okay, from which place we are coming with our prejudice and assumptions, and as you are saying, to be in conversation with science and spirituality, as a scientist with science, as a spiritual person with other spiritual people, and between one another. Real conversation always invites for openness, for letting go of control and assumptions, and being confronted with the unknown can be unsettling, to say the least, right?
When I knew we were going to have this conversation today, I looked up a quote. I mean, you're aware that I was initiated into bhakti practice by Prabhupada.
I am.
Bhakti Vedanta Swami Prabhupada. So I read in one of his letters, this was to a student from March of 1969. He wrote, I can give you a statement of Albert Einstein in which he says the most beautiful and most profound emotion we can experience is in the sensation of the mystical.
Yeah.
He to whom this emotion is a stranger, he who can no longer stand wrapped in awe, is as good as dead. That deeply emotional conviction of the presence of a superior reasoning power, which was revealed in the comprehensible universe, forms my idea of God.
Yeah.
And then in this letter, Prabhupada went on to write, I think that our movement is just following the same concept of God by awakening the dormant, transcendental emotion of the human being without any consideration of religious faith. He says, in our camp, my disciples are coming from different faiths, and why they were accepting the Sankirtan movement, this chanting, unless there is an awakening of mystical emotion described by the great scientists like Albert Einstein. Isn't that beautiful?
Yeah, I will ask you the link to that letter eventually. Yeah.
Yeah, it's from March of 1960. I mean, I think.
Yeah, and I love that quote from Einstein. I quoted that in my second book, Radical Personalism. That quote by Einstein, it's right there. It has to be there.
Yeah.
And it's somehow our own tradition also emphasizes that. I like to refer to the word chamatkar in Sanskrit, which means like astonishment or wonder. And there's one line from some of our teachers which says rasa sar chamatkar, or the essence of rasa, the essence of the highest mystical emotion is chamatkar, is wonder. No? So it's basically our version of Einstein's words, if you will. No?
Yeah. Again, I so admire my brother. I'm sorry to have to obsess about Brian, but when I live on Long Island, and where my wife and I live, we have a little land, and when you go out in the evening, especially in the summer months, the sky just goes on forever, and you can see the stars and the planets. There isn't too much interference from city lights around us. And when I look there, what I see has been so much enriched by my brother's work. What I read from him and his discussions with leading scientists, my appreciation of the creation is so much deeper. Thanks to that insight into the intricate, detailed, elegant workings of this magnificent creation of ours. I mean, how can you not be inspired by that kind of scientific insight into the workings of the universe? It's absolutely wonderful.
Yeah. Reminds me this famous quote by Heisenberg that the first gulp from the glass of natural sciences will turn you into an atheist, but at the bottom of the glass, God is waiting for you.
Right? Be careful what you drink.
Yeah. And in our tradition, I will say in our Bhakti tradition, one of our main texts, as you know, is the Srimad Bhagavatam or Bhagavad Purana. And I was reading it. I mean, I try to read it, the whole thing, once every year. And every reading comes, of course, something new. And this last time, since I was also writing my third book on concept of evolution in divine love and how the principle of ever-evolving love impacts matter and the soul and God himself, I was going through that with a little bit more scientific lenses in terms of also how matter reveal spirit, so to say. And I realized that in the Bhagavatam, every time there's some conversation begins and some questions are presented to the teacher, so to say, many times the answer, most of the times, begins with a description of the natural world in connection to the divine. It doesn't start like the soul, the super soul, Bhagavan. It starts right here, the cosmos, and how the cosmos is divine and sacred if looked with proper eyes. Like when Parikshit asks Sukadev, he starts with the universal form, and so on and so forth. So,
read 7th chapter Gita, read 12th chapter Gita. I mean, there's a poetry of nature there that's so inspiring, so beautiful. How you can see Krishna in the taste in water, in the light of the sun and the moon, and in the mountains and rivers. I mean, it's exquisite. It's just beautiful.
Yeah.
I also prepared, I don't know if it's of use to you, if you would like this, but I thought a little bit about maybe describing what the history is, how we've evolved from a Newtonian view of the world to a quantum view, and how that may connect with what we're learning in the Sanskrit text. Would that be of interest to your
Absolutely.
viewers?
Absolutely.
Well,
I don't know if to my viewers, or share to my viewers, but to again for me as well. So let me be selfish for a minute, and I'll take it fully, and everyone else will enjoy it as well. Yeah.
Well, if you go back again to this kind of awakening that occurred in the 17th century, that by exercising our imagination and creativity, we can actually come up with an understanding of how things work, and the invention of the steam engine, which led to so many understandings of the motions of particles and so on. This fascinating awakening to the fact that this mysterious universe that used to be completely relegated to the hands of church fathers and religionists, there's a logic to it that we can grasp, we can understand.
Yeah.
And Newton, who is one of the great figures in the history of humanity, was able to come up with principles of the operations of this universe, and he applied that mathematical formula to the motion of planets and galaxies. And for the longest time, that was the way we saw the world, and it still is in large measure. I mean, the Newtonian physics are the physics by which we live every day. If I pick up a baseball and throw it at you, and if you know the distance that I'm throwing it and the force with which I'm throwing it and the trajectory, you can pretty much anticipate when the ball is going to come and how you're going to catch it. I mean, that's Newtonian physics. It's predictable. It works, and that's all great. So that's called the classical world of physics. And Einstein was the last great classical physicist. He came along and realized, just through thought experiments, he didn't have lab tests, this was just thinking on his part, that this Newtonian view of things works in slow motion, in a world that's cold and slow. If you speed things up, the closer you get to the speed of light, right, the less these Newtonian principles work. They don't work at very fast speeds. They don't work on very far distant levels of galaxies. Things change there, and he saw that. So that's the Newtonian universe, the grand scale of things. Then other minds came along in the 1920s, 1930s. You have Niels Bohr and others who introduced ideas of quantum mechanics that said Einstein's picture, this smooth, large universe, it doesn't, those principles don't work when you go very, very small. You go into the subatomic world, and the farther down you go, the more jittery and the more unpredictable things become, right? So what gets revealed when you go down to those small dimensions are what we might call hidden dimensions. So I'll give you an example. Imagine for a moment an ant walking along a line. So that ant only has two options. There's forward and back. It's a two-dimensional universe there, right?
Yeah.
So what if you move up closer and you see that line is actually not a line, that it's the length of garden hose. So now all of a sudden there's a surface there, and the ant has these other options. The ant can go around the hose this way, can go around the hose that way. If you drill a hole through the hose, the ant can go inside. There are other dimensions all hidden in there as well. So that's maybe a way of visualizing the idea of these hidden dimensions to the universe, pointed to by quantum mechanics. So it turns out, and here's things get really crazy, is that on that subatomic scale, things become susceptible to our power of thinking. That the fundamental atomic processes occur randomly, but human intention, the intervention of an observation, of an observer, influences the outcome of the experiment. So we don't have the time to go into all this now, but the classic example is the wave particle experiment, where a beam of, let's say, electron particles out of an electron gun pointed at two slits will behave in very different ways, sometimes as particles of light, these discrete pinpoints of things, and sometimes like an abstract wave. How can something act in two completely different ways? How is that even possible? We've never been able to explain it. Science has been baffled by that. But what we find is that when we impose observation, when you put an instrument of observation, watching those particles go through those slits, all of a sudden it behaves one way or the other. It's as though it knows it's being looked at and starts changing its behavior. So it's very, very weird stuff. And we live on these two levels, don't we? We who study the Bhagavad Gita, we live on the world of, we accept that there's truth to science. And then we have this other dimension of Sanskrit language and concepts that really don't fit with that. So it's a bit schizophrenic. And a lot of my devotee friends are quite schizophrenic, actually. But again, the farther you go down, the weirder it gets. Electrons can jump from one orbit, a lower orbit, to a higher orbit without traversing any intermediary space. How is that possible? That defies the Einsteinian rule of speed of light. If the jump happens simultaneously without traversing any space, then it's traveling faster than the speed of light. How does that work? There's also something called superposition. A particle can be in two places at the same time. It can be in neither place at the same time. It can be in 1,000 places at the same time. And you can't even ask about these things because it defies rational thought. It's like saying, is the number 5 married? Or is tofu Democrat or Republican? I mean, you can't ask questions. It's mind-boggling, right?
Yeah.
So
invites us to maybe remain in awe for some time, right?
that things are more mysterious than we can imagine. And you said earlier something very important, that one of the great qualities of science is that it is self-corrective.
Yeah.
Good science admits, we thought this way, and then we found out that we're wrong. That, we've discovered new information and it's in a different direction now. That's very good science.
And in one sense, I will say good science is also about being confronted with the mysterious. And as you are just describing, it's like a daily confrontation with an unknown new layer of reality. And in one sense, I don't want to force meanings, but we could describe faith somehow similarly also. Like faith means a journey into coexisting with mystery in different ways. I'm not trying to make the two the same, but they share enough common properties in their own journey, so to say, both being confronted with the mysterious, the eternal, the ineffable, the unlimited, and being okay at coexisting with that, not wanting to bring closure, not wanting to end the case. And as you are saying very nicely, Yogeshwar Prabhu, and all the things that you have just described you are not even talking yet about consciousness, but we are talking about matter, right? So because sometimes in scientific circles, they will talk about the hard problem of consciousness and we have to solve that. But first we have the hard problem of matter, right? In terms
you're making
of
good
dynamics.
These are very important. These are not small points that you're raising here. These are very, very, these are foundational, issues. If all that someone looks at is the visible world, if their reality is based on what they can quantify, then their behavior is going to be one particular way, But if you're capable of looking beyond that, beneath the surface of things, at what cannot be known just by sensory perception and logical analysis, you get a very different worldview. And I'm going to go out on a limb here, which I do all the time anyway, and go so far as to say that for me, I can't espouse this as an idea that anyone else should accept. So I'm just taking this on my own shoulders here. For me, the more I learn about the operations of the subatomic world, the more I learn about the anomalies of quantum mechanics, superposition and quantum entanglement, and what Einstein called spooky action at a distance, and so on, things that defy our logic and reason, the more it strikes me that the universe is waiting to find out what we want to do. That things are created in such a way that it favors the journey to self-awareness. That the limits of our intelligence, the limits of our perceptions have intent, that it's good that we have limits, because then we're obliged to consider that maybe I'm something more than just the collection of the experiences of this one lifetime. Maybe my attitude toward you could go deeper because I've been judging by externals. It strikes me that there's something very profound about the forward movement of humanity, how we can maybe get this world back on track if there's a willingness for these two perspectives, a scientific perspective and a metaphysical perspective, to talk together and work cooperatively.
Thank you. I appreciate how you articulated something that I personally also have been thinking and talking about regarding our rational intellectual faculties. Of course, they are there for some reason. We have to make the best possible use of them. But for me, the success, their success in our life, or our success in engaging with them, is when they show us their limits, so to say. When we have used them so much enough that they take us to their limit and say, I can only take you this far in the journey, and from now on, you are confronted with something that clearly requires another method, transrational, however you may like to call it, but there's something bigger than the reach of our own mind and intellect. And of course, that's when the metaphysical, the mystical comes into place, not as, again, sentimental belief, fanatical stuff, but as a genuine experiential conclusion after having tried to use as much as I could my mind and my brain and my faculties, and being confronted with a layer of reality that clearly requires another passport to access, so to say, right?
I like that. Yeah, another passport. That's a good way of describing it.
Yeah. And for me, it goes back to what we were talking before, this idea of being willing to enter that space, which is clearly outside of the comfort zone. And also, as I like to think in terms of, we have the comfort zone as a circle, and a bigger circle could be the learning zone, and a bigger circle could be the panic zone. So we don't want to end up there. That could be too much either, but we don't want to remain the comfort zone. So how to navigate the course and remain in a learning experiential zone of opening. And for me, that requires so much of letting go, as you say, that our maybe greatest temptation or addiction even is this idea of, as you say, we got it, bringing closure as spiritualists, as scientists, but the real spiritualists and scientists won't go there, actually. No? And for me, that's the definition of Maya. Maya means that which can be controlled, right? So that which can be measured. A measurement has to do with controlling something that I can measure. And the more you go deep into all this, you realize I cannot measure anything, basically. I cannot predict.
Maybe the greater your certitude of having a handle on truth, the deeper the Maya.
Yeah. A mentor of mine will ask, very interestingly, he will ask, what's the opposite of faith? Now, most people will say doubt. He'll say, no, the opposite of faith is certitude, he'll say. Because faith is not about being certain and having my dogmas and my beliefs and I'm correct. I'm bringing closure to everything.
No, that's very important. I get a lot of people asking me, what's this Krishna thing you're into?
Good question.
That's a big one,
Good
what's this little blue cowherd boy? What's that? What's that all about?
How we get
and
there,
so I roll my eyes because I say, oh God, what do I do with this? And
from subatomic particles to the blue cowherd boy, how to get there?
let's put blue coward boys aside just for a minute.
Yes.
and talk about something that we can get our arms around. And that is, you mentioned a moment ago that we haven't even really gotten into the discussion about consciousness yet. And that's the foundation of everything. And we can talk about what is the nature of consciousness after.
Yeah.
Is it nirguna Brahman, saguna Brahman? Does it, does it have form, or is it formless, and all that kind of thing? And then we can get into, if it is with form and personality, where does it live? And are there other forms and personalities? So that's advanced bhakti stuff. We don't need to go there today. But certainly it's true that with all of the spokespeople from different worlds of science whom I have the privilege of interacting with, there's a general agreement that it's all coming down to this question of consciousness. About every 2 months here in New York, I have a dinner talk in my apartment. My wife and I have a small place in the city. And we have neuroscientists, we have people working with brain research. I have coming up at the end of March, Nina Bardwaj from Mount Sinai Hospital. She's one of the great cancer researchers in the world. There's a cosmologist, Priya Natarajan from Yale, coming down later in the year. And we have an informal dinner. It's just a bunch of us, and a lot of the guests are postdocs or grad students or people working in different scientific fields. And it's a wonderful opportunity to talk about where has your particular field of research come now? Where is it at? Where are things at today? And there seems to be this kind of thread of continuity over the many discussions, and no matter what their background is, whatever their field is, that we're reaching a point of having to acknowledge consciousness as an active player in what we do. That whether it's healthcare and the notion that the patient has a role to play in his or her healing and wellness and management of their physical and mental conditions. And a lot of that has to do with what is the internal story they tell themselves. Now we're getting down to a level of what is consciousness, what is identity, whether it's in fields of, one of the questions I've prepared for Nina Bardwaj is, how is it that cancer seems to be so cunning? Cancer cells seem to be alive. They seem to have personality. They're able to work their way around any obstacle, any vaccine that we throw in their direction. They work their way around it. They learn to adapt to it. They find food in some other way. They nourish themselves. They grow. They spread. And it's almost as if they have an intentional personality that's looking to do these things. And she said, you're absolutely right. It's what makes cancer so difficult to tackle, is that it's almost as though you have a conscious entity trying to do an end run around what you're doing, what you're introducing as a vaccine, however personalized it may be. The same is true in AI, of course. We're asking ourselves, can systems achieve conscious awareness? So we're really, really drilling down now to a point where defining consciousness is, I believe, going to be the very next wave of everything. And that's where I think those of us who are studying this culture, the Bhakti tradition, have a lot to contribute, and a lot we can offer there.
Yeah. And regarding defining what consciousness is, also, I will say, because not to fall into simplistic one-liners, like, okay, I can say what consciousness is, I can quote this line. In one sense, defining consciousness, consciousness remains one of the most challenging concepts to define, right? I recall even hearing one contemporary scientist, you may know him, Bernardo Kastrup. He's very much into studies of consciousness, and he studies wisdom traditions and so on. And he will say, like, we cannot define consciousness in terms of anything else, but we can define everything else in terms of consciousness. That will be his take. Of course, I'm not saying everyone says the same thing, but he will say that point. Like when talking about, for me, that makes me think also similarly to when Krishna speaks in the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita and starts saying what the Atma, the soul, is. Another way of saying what consciousness is in one way. But he starts with what Christians will call via negativa, right? Speaking about what consciousness is not, right? The soul cannot be burned, cannot be dried, cannot be killed, does not die, is not born. And at the point that he has said enough what consciousness or the soul is not, it comes the moment like, okay, maybe we are on top of our seats. Like, so what consciousness is? And you have this, I like to think it like that in that section of the Gita. You reach verse 29 where Krishna uses the word ascharya 3 times, which means amazing or wonderful. And he says the soul is wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. That's, so to say, that's as much as he can say, so to say, about consciousness. Like at one point, even words do not suffice, right? To say something about that.
Well, here's the thing. It's wonderful that we can have this discussion. And again, I'm going out on a limb maybe a little bit, which is I've got a permanent seat there, so it doesn't bother me. The universe is multidimensional, sufficiently complex and multidimensional that it can accommodate many kinds of truths.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it's necessary for second chapter Bhagavad Gita to be true that biological evolutionary definitions need to be false. I don't think that's a prerequisite.
I agree.
I think it's possible for us to have an appreciation of the miracle of nature. And if you look in second and third canto Bhagavatam, there's actually descriptions of how the species evolve and they come out one after the other. There's a very, very clear parallel there with Darwinian evolutionary processes. And, I don't win a lot of friends when I say things like that,
I have a whole section in my forthcoming third book exactly about what you just said. And I'm already expecting losing a few friends because of that. Hopefully winning a few others as well.
What have you gone over to the dark side now? I mean, what's happened? What's happened to my dear friend?
At least I know I will have you as my friend on that side, probably.
I'm here for you. You can call me whenever you like.
You can count on me as well. Thank you.
So it's possible to embrace many different definitions of consciousness, and they don't have to be contradictory. I think they can be complementary. And the more we develop the willingness, the ability to do that, to respectfully consider other languages with which to define the majesty of Krishna's creation, right? The more likely it is that someday, we might find a path back to sanity. So
beautiful.
At least that's I hope that's my hope is that we can get there someday.
I really appreciate your emphasis on discovering our other languages to bring us back to sanity, because for me, it's especially this last year, been studying a little bit more deeply the importance of articulation and the words we use, that sometimes we just underestimate. We just use certain words and they create our world, basically. They create our realities. So words are not merely, sounds to define things. No, a word is not, the use of a word is not merely to define something, but it actually shapes and creates an experience, a reality. So depending which, as you say, which language we use, which words we resort to, that will impact on the way and the quality of the experience of what we are going through. So we may need to maybe revise, update, deconstruct, reconstruct our lingo to create a new experience of reality. in my opinion, at least.
Yeah. Well, what you're saying is beautiful and important, and it makes me think that someday in the yoga world,
Mm-hmm.
there'll be an appreciation for yoga as a way of slowing down what people like to quote Patanjali, or the chittavritti nirodha,
Mm-hmm.
these agitations of the mind, and to be able to make the connection with what you just said, that if you slow down the mind, what is the evidence that you've slowed it down? That you'll be more careful with your words.
Mm.
You'll be very, very cautious about what you say, how you say it. You'll take that extra moment to reflect. What will the impact be of the words I'm about to speak?
Mm-hmm.
Will this be for someone's benefit? Or is what I am saying going to be hurtful? Am I putting more, negative energy out into the world?
Mm-hmm.
I hope that happens, because it's a critical component. What is silence? When Krishna says, of secret things I am silence, I mean, what does that mean? Yeah, I don't think it means you don't say anything. I mean, I think it means that when you speak, it is devoid of hurtful, negative energy. That that part is silenced.
And I will, yeah, I totally agree with you. And I will add to that, because that's one of my favorite sections of the Gita. Also, silence could be, I go literally into silence, but silence will be to listen. In silence, I'm not just not talking, but I'm listening.
Mm-hmm.
And then whatever I speak comes out from that silence, so to say,
Mm-hmm.
right? So my silence informs my speaking, as you are saying, right?
Yeah.
And for me, all this is crucial for the theme we are talking about today, which is conversation and dialogue between science and spirituality. I mean, again, dialogue and conversation cannot happen if I'm just talking without slowing down, talking without listening, talking without silence. So, ideally, the ideal
my dear
conversation.
friend, it may be that the only way we're going to work ourselves out of this hole that we've dug is by accepting that being right is not what it's all about. If we can set aside our certitude
Yep.
that we have the proper understanding, long enough to do what you're describing, just listen, opening his ears, and just listen to what people say. Then maybe we can, create those channels of communication. But it certainly won't happen if we just go about pontificating that, we know and you don't.
So you may have heard about this research that was done some time ago, that they were asked people, do you prefer to be right or to be happy? And most people went to the be right. It was kind of like 75%. I stay with being right, despite that makes me miserable. So they were that showing like how addicted we are to hold on to those toxic sense of certainties that somehow define our identity. I will feel that behind that unwillingness to let go is the unwillingness to let go a part of me, or a sense of identity that has been constructed upon those certainties. So we are, as you say, there's fear behind, right?
Well, if we put ourselves in the position of some of your guests watching this conversation, right?
Mm-hmm.
They might very well be thinking to themselves, well, that all sounds very nice, but the fact is, when I finish watching this thing and I got to go back to living my life, I'm going to make decisions based on what I know is right. I'm not going to be going around questioning my own sanity and my own reasoning ability so I'm not quite sure I can get what these two guys are talking about. It all sounds very nice, but practically I don't see how it works. And I think we have to appreciate that. We also tend to get wrapped up a little bit in our rhetoric and can talk about things that may not, from another point of view, and it may not sound reasonable. So it's important perhaps to mention as an adjunct to what we've been saying that the channel of dialogue opening up by being willing to say, I may have my convictions, but I'm putting them aside long enough to listen to what you have to say with an open mind, doesn't mean losing your convictions.
Exactly.
Doesn't mean that you have to become somebody different, that you have to give up what you think. That's not the idea. The idea is, okay, you have a point of view. Well, that's wonderful, right? Here are some things that might enhance your point of view, not replace it. It might help you to see deeper into what it's like the different people holding the different parts of the elephant.
Yeah.
Everybody has their own reality, Is the elephant big, tall, thick, thin, small, sharp, soft? It's all those things.
All of them are right and all of them are wrong at the same time.
Or let's say all of them are incomplete.
Yeah.
That
not the bigger picture.
Yeah, that we can learn from others and what their part of the elephant is like. So
even if
science certainly can do that.
Yeah, even if I choose to stay, okay, my chosen part of the elephant, so to say, is this one, my favorite one. I stay with that, but I can realize there's another perspective that is complementary or more tasteful.
Let me give you a practical. Here's a practical example. I was giving a Bhagavad Gita class at Integral Yoga here in New York some years ago. And as happens in almost every Bhagavad Gita class, the discussion came around to vegetarianism. That somehow always, happens.
Can someone who is not vegetarian go to heaven, Yogeshwar? What do you think?
Maybe something like that. So no matter where I start off, very sophisticated, complex ideas, it comes down to food and relationships and jobs. Those three things. It's like about 5 minutes in, one of those three things.
Let's be grounded. Yeah.
So we're talking about it, and recognizing consciousness in different bodies and so on. Okay. So then a hand goes up at the back of the room. And this woman who's been attending classes every week faithfully and says, I love coming to these Bhagavad Gita discussions. I get so much out of them, but I don't think I'm going to come back because I'm sick and tired of being made to feel like a second-class citizen. I cannot be a vegetarian. I tried and I got very sick. And I've been to many different doctors and they've all told me, look, vegetarian diet is wonderful, but you need certain proteins and you need certain things that, you may have to get in other ways. So I wasn't going to argue with her about, well, have you been to the right doctors? I mean, that's silly. But it was a very important lesson for me. It's so easy for me to come off as, holier than thou because, why? Because I've been chanting for 55 years or whatever. That doesn't make me a realized being. It gives me a point of view maybe. And so I'm at this old, stage of my life. I'm still learning too. It's hard. It's a hard thing to do, to set aside your own certitude long enough to really listen to what other people have to say, but it's so critically important. So important.
I recall once I made a post from Jordan Peterson. You may have heard about him. And of course, this doesn't mean that I agree with everything he says, but there was something I really agree with. I liked it. And I quoted, I like to share things from other people, which that doesn't mean that I agree with them in total in everything they say, which sometimes that's the assumption. And someone posted like, but Maharaj, how can you quote that? His diet is based only in meat. He has this situation. So we cannot learn anything from someone who has such a diet. Like a magnified example of what you were sharing. And I was chuckling and I commented like, so Do you have something to learn in the Bhagavad Gita? Yes. Okay, just in case, because one of the two main characters, Arjuna, he's not vegetarian, actually, by the way. If you go to the Mahabharata and he's like hunting some animals and eating them, that's mentioned there in the Shastra. So what we are to make out of that? No, like, okay, Arjuna has nothing to teach me because he's not vegetarian. He's a Nitya Siddha, the eternal associate of Krishna. Again, these ideas that kind of unsettle the whole system and invites us to think. It doesn't mean that let's stop being vegetarian, therefore, because I'm choosing that from a particular place, but that doesn't mean, at least in my conviction, that someone who is not vegetarian is not as advanced or closer to God, cannot go to heaven. I mean, there are so many considerations there.
Because they may be just 1 week away from being so much more enlightened than you are. Better be careful about what you say. You don't know who you're talking to.
Mm-hmm.
Someone can change, and a phone call can change everything.
Yeah.
Someone can be transformed in a very, very short order. I remember when I was a lad back in London in 1970, where there was someone an Indian gentleman who had a grocery store, and he was selling meat and fish. And some of my comrades in the London Krishna temple asked Prabhupada, should they ask this person who wanted to be initiated to stop selling these things? And Prabhupada said, you don't need to say anything to him. Just give him a chance.
Mm-hmm.
And then he did receive initiation. And that same person's name was Kshirodakshayi Vishnu, was his devotee name. He became the first president of the Vrindavan India temple. He became a very important person in the society. And so you got to cool your jets. I mean, we're so quick to judge, and what do we know?
Yeah. For me, all that are varieties of saying what is Maya, right? Trying to measure, trying to control, trying to judge, putting people in boxes. It's all basically extensions of this word, what it means to be in Maya, because sometimes we are reductionistic and think being in Maya means this or that period. But I mean, we are in Maya all day long because we are labeling and putting people in boxes, and that's a tendency to exert control over the environment, basically, and not allowing things to be all that they can be, so to say. That's something that I like always to think in terms of potential, because some people may be something, including us now, but there's a potential to be so much more. So if we label everything, we do not allow potentiality to unfold, and it's starting with ourselves, what to speak of the environment, right?
I suspect you and I are attracted by the same kind of person, someone who thinks reasonably and has a cool head and open-minded. And we look, those of us who are on a mission here, we know that not everyone's going to be interested in what we have to say. We know that. If we're trying to bring some wider perspective to people's thinking, the fact of the matter is, it's very intimidating. What the rest of the world thinks of someone who chants on beads and dresses and robes and like, good luck to them, whatever they are, but that's not for me. So I'm amused these days that some of the people who used to look askance at me when I was a temple devotee and wore robes, today they're fellow chanters and meditators. And that gives me that's a kick. So just be patient. I think we need to cultivate patience.
Yeah. And I think regarding this main theme of conversation between faith and reason with other people or with ourselves or among our community, patience is a crucial. I mean, if we expect this whole thing to happen even in this decade or in this generation, it may take some time. But at the same time, acknowledging what needs to be done, baby steps need to be done here and now, and hopefully being able to be part of that, and with detachment at the same time.
How many millennia did it take for the Bhagavad Gita to come out of India?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this knowledge has gone worldwide only within the past, 100 years or something?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, again, time frames are very, very relative from our particular.
Sure.
What we think should be quick and should happen, and the timings of every cosmic timings and people's timings. So, yeah, totally.
I must say I enjoy my time with you. I'm having a lovely conversation, and thank you for doing these podcasts. I've listened to quite a few of them now, and I admire what you're doing.
Thank you. I really appreciate your words, and I'm happy that you accepted the invitation. I wanted to have you for some time already. And I personally don't like to, I usually do not invite just any person. I try to go very intentional into who my guests are, because I really like to get along with the other person and be connected, and it has to be someone I know and I feel some deep alignment with. So your case is not an exception to that rule. So thanks for being here. So Yogeshwar Prabhu, as we are wrapping up, probably I'm thinking, as I also am introduced to you, I like to conclude some of my conversations more recently with sometimes in our bhakti tradition, there's this saying, Madhurena Samapayat, like at the end of something, end with something sweet, whether it is while eating or while talking. But recently I've inaugurated another variety of it. In Sanskrit could be called Ushnena Samapayat, or end with something hot or spicy. So I'd like to, if you agree, I'd like to present you some short, brief, hot questions. Not so hot, don't feel the seat burning. And I will expect some similarly short answer from you, so we can conclude with a few back and forth in that direction. It reminds me of Ramananda Roy and Mahaprabhu in their conversation. At the end, they had this like short question and answer at the end. So trying to honor that.
I'll do my best.
Okay. Let's go to the first one. There are a few, just going back to our main theme, right? Science and faith, spirituality, and reason. So what's one scientific discovery that in your view most profoundly supports a spiritual perspective?
Oh, goodness. A scientific discovery that most profoundly informs a spiritual perspective.
Supports a spiritual perspective.
I would have to say whatever the most recent discovery is. I mean, I'm absolutely stunned by the elegance of the photographs coming back from the James Webb Telescope. It's extraordinary. I mean, we've never been able to peer that deeply into the history of the universe before. And the clarity and the colors and the depth of what we're seeing is absolutely breathtaking.
Thank you. Beautiful. Second question. What's a spiritual idea that you think most challenges modern science?
A spiritual idea that most challenges science is a question. The question being, who is it who says there is no permanent self?
Okay.
Kind of just backing up a little bit, and tracing it down to its roots.
What's the biggest misconception scientists have about faith?
That it's arbitrary, irrational, unscientific. That it's for people who do not have an appreciation for the elegance of mathematics and research, and that it has nothing to contribute to what they're doing.
Okay. And now, what's the biggest misconception faith people have about scientists or about science.
that they're stubborn, closed-minded, anti-religious, and incapable of understanding anything deeper than what they can see in their microscopes.
Okay. Oh, a few more. You mentioned that briefly before. Does artificial intelligence, AI, have the potential for consciousness, or is that a human illusion?
I'm hoping our politicians have the potential for consciousness, frankly, at this point, let alone AI. I'm on the fence about this. At the end of the day, I do not believe that a construct, however sophisticated, can duplicate a non-material source of self-awareness. I think what AI does is to brilliantly mimic the mechanics of consciousness, but that's different. The mechanics, the workings of consciousness are not the same thing as consciousness.
Yeah. And I would think we have to be very careful as humans to preserve our humanity, because the less we do so, the more the line between what AI offers and our own human consciousness would blur, and we won't notice the difference, basically, right?
Yeah. It's very seductive in that way. It's a kind of drug. I find myself using it more and more myself, and I wonder if this is a healthy thing or not.
How are you dealing with ChatGPT these days, Yogeshwar Prabhu?
Well, we have a decent relationship.
Getting to know each other more and more.
In stages.
Yeah, it's a gradual development. Okay. So if you had to bet, and here I'm not inviting you to gamble, we're not going there, but it's a way of saying, will science ever prove the existence of the soul?
I think science will pave the way for that. I think science, one of the most exciting things that I'm seeing in fields of science is how close it's coming to acknowledging that there is this substrate beneath the workings of matter that is a separate element from matter, that it's not part of the standard model of the universe, that there is something more. I think many scientists are prejudiced by the evidence and the research into thinking that consciousness, if you follow the physics down far enough, you'll find consciousness. Myself, I have a much more, let's say, mystical view of things. But certainly science is coming closer to the point where that makes us feel good too. When we have this empiric reinforcement, that there's something going on there that we don't understand, then maybe I'm not just a religious fanatic after all.
The last two questions, Yogeshwar Prabhu. If you could ask one question to an enlightened sage, what will that be today?
Well, when's your next class? I don't know.
That's a good one. And if you could ask one question to a leading physicist, what will that be? Probably that's your brother's.
When's your next class?
Good, great. I was waiting for the exact same answer. Great. Okay, that's it. You're free from the hot seat and the hot spicy questions. You did
Thank you.
Great. And before we conclude, Yogeshwar Prabhu, if you could leave our listeners with one powerful takeaway, be it a challenge, an invitation, fresh perspective, a dose of inspiration, what will that be?
Don't get discouraged. The path forward can be very bumpy, and every one of us comes up against hurdles and setbacks, and there are times when you just want to throw in the towel and give up. But don't get discouraged. The process works. The chanting works. If you just keep at it every day, just keep going every day, follow your daily practice, whatever it may be, there's a cumulative effect. Eventually you'll feel it, you'll know it, and that's a beautiful thing.
Thank you so much for coming, Yogeshwar Prabhu.
Very welcome.